Shabbat Shalom. In Pirkei Avot, chapter 5, the text reads, "Every dispute that is for the sake of heaven will in the end endure. Kol machlochet shehi l'shem shamayim sofa lehitkayem. But one that is not for the sake of heaven will not endure." The text continues, "Which is a controversy for the sake of heaven? Such was the controversy or machloket of Hillel and Shammai. And which was the controversy or machloket that is not for the sake of heaven? Such is the controversy of Korah and his congregation." So if you read commentaries, rabbis, even modern day Divrei Torah on the Parashat, it's clear rabbis are not fond of Korah. Each year when we meet a Parsha, we are different, as is the world, and we see something new. So when I approached Korah this week, I was immediately bothered by how Korah is viewed as a wrongdoer or even a villain. I'm going to try to make my case. First, I'll give you a rundown of the Parsha. So Korah was from the tribe of Levi, who were tasked with the religious duties, like caring for the Mishkan and its contents. But despite this important role, Korah, along with Israelites Datan and Aviram, challenged Moshe and Aharon as leaders. They said, "Rav lachem ki kol ha'eda kulam kadoshim uvtocham Adonai umadua titnasu al kahal Adonai." You have gone too far, for all the community are holy, all of them, and God is in their midst. Why then do you raise yourself above God's congregation? Moshe, shocked at this form of dissent, then challenges Korah to what feels like some sort of duel, like a Hamilton style, Alexander Hamilton, Aaron Burr. He says, "Come in the morning, and God will make known who is the holiest and who will get direct access to God. So come and lay your fire pans as an offering, and we'll see who God picks." And then Moshe uses language that mocks Korah. "Rav lachem b'nei Levi, you have gone too far, sons of Levi." Isn't your role enough, Moshe says? So thus far, Korah is expressing truth. Under Moshe and Aharon's leadership, the Israelites are now stuck in the desert for more than 40 years after last week's Parsha, and Korah speaks other truths as well, directly from God's words, that all the Israelites are holy. He's pointing out seemingly obvious things and offering a critique of their leadership. Now, many rabbis will point out that Korah is rebelling against the structure of leadership, and we know from Torah and life that we always need some sort of hierarchy in our world. And yet, I don't know if Korah's behavior is bad enough to be so wrong. So Rashi said that the verse that opens the Parsha, that introduces Korah, the words are Vayikach Korah. Korah took his family to rise up, is essentially what it says. And Rashi says that means Korah was separating himself from the community to be elevated to priesthood. However, a Midrash describes this phrase as Korah using gentle words to persuade Moshe, an interpretation that I resonate with. And I think Moshe is the one who gets defensive. Moshe says, "You have a good role, Korah. Stop railing against me and wanting your cousin Aaron's role." Moshe here seems afraid of some sort of insurrection he's sensing. But it's unclear to me what sort of real action Korah and his followers were going to take against Moshe and Aharon. Datan and Aviram, however, take this a bit further, criticizing Moshe's leadership and power over them. They say, "Egypt, it was the land of milk and honey, and you took us here." Now, this is a bit problematic. I think it's harsh criticism, it's hyperbole, it's manipulation to be problematic. But it's different than what Korah said. So, as we go on, during the duel, God dramatically chooses Moshe and Aharon. God caused the ground to split open and swallow Korach's followers and their families, Dotan and Aviram included. Meanwhile, fire comes out and consumes the 250 men who had offered incense. This divine punishment demonstrated that God had indeed chosen Moshe and Aharon to lead the people and perform the sacred duties. However, there's something missing here. The text didn't say what happened to Korah. Chapters later, recalling the events, say that Korah was swallowed up with Datan and Aviram, but it's not mentioned here in this story as it's unfolding. So even Ezra asks, why wasn't Korah mentioned here? And he notes that some commentators think Korah was burned by the fire, and some think he was swallowed. However, using the logic of how the Torah describes Pharaoh's death when his chariots drowned in the Red Sea, but doesn't mention Pharaoh drowned, so too Ibn Ezra says Korah dies when his 250 people were burned. There's an assumption that when the villain's team is described as meeting their end, so too is the leader. So maybe that's fair, but I still see a lack of clarity about where Korah went. And so maybe it's not far-fetched to make something of the manner Korah and his 250 followers died, as sacrifices along with their incense, and not swallowed in the ground, like Datan and Aviram. They were burned makrivei hakatoret, offering incense. However, our word for sacrifice, when regarding the Mishkan, is the Hebrew word karav, or to approach. So my teachers, the teachers at Pardes, Rabbi Tzvi Hirschfeld and Mike Foyer, said, therefore, Korah was part of a sacrificial offering to get closer to God by Moshe. Aaron's son Eleazar removes the charred fire pans, and the text said that they were an offering, so their sacrifices were also accepted. The text then says the sacrifices that will serve as warning, they will now serve as warning to the people of Israel, but it doesn't specify the warning. So God and Moshe seek to punish Korah for his rebellion, but the rabbis take this further and villainize him. Clearly there's an agenda for God and Moshe to be in the right, and Korah must be wrong. But what if the way some dissenters were sacrificed is there to teach us that dissent is one way to be drawn nearer to God? So it's worth mentioning that, like all humans, I believe the rabbis had their own agendas often in their writings and commentaries. And sometimes a critical eye could call them agendas that maybe weren't always for l'shem shamayim, for the sake of heaven. The Talmudic rabbis are considered by some in historical circles to be a fringe group of academics with power that they were trying to acquire, assert their power, assert their knowledge of God, and create a need for themselves, for Judaism to live on. So if that's true, this pasuk in Pirkei Avot, to elevate Hillel and Shammai, has an agenda, one of their own, and to put down Korah. It's not hard to do, as putting down Korah makes sure not to criticize Moshe or God. And yet, what might they be trying to tell us about squashing certain types of dissent? Dr. David Bialy, a professor of Jewish history from UC Davis, wrote, "It's perhaps not surprising that those seeking to defend the tradition had little choice but to reach for an archetype from within the tradition to label those trying to divorce themselves from it." Now we know the rabbis loved machloket, or debate, as the entire Talmud feels like one machloket bleeding into another. Yet, I think this is showing us that the rabbis might have been afraid of a certain type of machloket. A machloket from within that maybe was threatening their power. A machloket that calls out painful contradictions in our texts. A machloket challenging the authority of who is in charge of steering the entire Jewish people. In an essay entitled Dissent, Abraham Joshua Heschel called Dissent indigenous to Judaism. He writes, "The greatness of the prophets was their ability to voice dissent and disagreement, not only with the beliefs of their pagan neighbors, but also with the cherished values and habits of their own people." So here too, Heschel lifts up voices in our tradition who might have been seen as outsiders, or folks stating the truth that were too painful to hear or too far-fetched to believe. We revere the prophets now as the ones who knew, the ones who guided us and led us in some of the values we hold so dear today, and the ones who were truly hearing God's word when no one else was listening. Dr. Michal Raucher, a religious studies scholar from Rutgers, in an article entitled "Dissent is Not a Dirty Word," wrote, "As long as we continue to vilify Korah, we persist in reinforcing an unjust hegemony. All over the world, people are fighting against unjust governments and brutal leaders. They are fighting against a system that has marginalized them by nature of being born into the wrong families." So, what if we flip the interpretation of Korah on its head as we read Korah? As Hirschfeld and Feuer said, if the sacrifices Korah offered and was even burned as a sacrifice, are the process of nearing God, then there must be sparks from those sacrifices that offer us a teaching of how to be nearer to God through dissent. Maybe that teaching is for us to learn about the righteousness of Korah's dissent. And maybe a lesson for this Shabbat is finding reason and time and the right modality to bring about good, healthy, productive dissent. And this is not just about hearing the opposition, but it has a deeper meaning for those of us who care about justice and equality. A teacher and mentor of mine, someone well known to this community, Rabbi Sharon Brous in LA, challenged her community, Ikar, a few years back about this Parsha and said, "Imagine if we hear the story as it reads, instead of how it's read by our rabbis. Imagine if we hear it as a moment of protest. Can we hear the voice of the desperate and marginalized?" She writes, "There's a danger of creating spaces where we don't allow voices that come from the margins and force us to become uncomfortable and think about things differently. Instead, if we blame the opposition, as our rabbis do with Korah, and put up walls, we aren't able to see the voice of humanity," she calls it. She presents the community with two avenues for how to view Korah. Korah is either a populist leader who, as the rabbis suggest, is concerned with his own power and influence in the Israelite community, or Korah sees what Moshe and Aharon do not. Korah understands and hears the voice of humanity calling us to recognize and to empathize with the reality and the impact our laws and systems have on real human beings. Korah wants us to see what we normally would not be able to see. So this research, this deep dive in the Parashat this week was not what I expected when I came to question Korah's motives. And yet, I believe this is the spark of Torah from Korah's sacrifice that could bring us nearer to God on this Shabbat. How do we hold dissent in our lives, both our personal lives and our public lives? What are the ways we are allowing opposition to enter our hearts and our minds, or the levers of power we have control over? How can leaders allow opposition as a source of growth instead of putting up walls? And we see this everywhere today, in government, here in Israel. We see this in our own American Jewish community, as Rolly called on us a few weeks ago to speak out against Jewish established organizations. I see this in how we walk through the world and allow feedback or criticism, or don't allow feedback or criticism, or anything that we might feel could break in opposing views to break into our mindset. But when we challenge the norms, we can be opened up to new possibilities. And maybe this is how we can get nearer to God. So, for what I believe to be l'shem shamayim, for the sake of heaven, I dissent from the rabbis that Korah and his congregation represent an argument that was not for the sake of heaven. I don't believe everything Korah did was perfect, and maybe we could have another machloket and sermon about how to go about dissent. However, I believe they entered our narrative to teach us how important it is to listen to opposing viewpoints, lift up the marginalized, and allow healthy feedback for one's life and leadership. By challenging the establishment, we can take down outsized personal agendas and open ourselves up to a new way of thinking. And maybe this is what machloket l'shem shamayim actually is. So, how can we incorporate dissent into our lives, both offering dissent and receiving it? If Korah wasn't perfect, how can we think about methods of organizing or communicating so the dissent is heard and considered? This dissent is crucial for us to live in a world that sees every human being as made in the image of God. The Bertinoro on Pirkei Avot said that the way machloket endures, as the Pirkei Avot verse that I started with said, the way machloket endures is that the people engaged in the conflict will endure, and they will not be lost. That's why this idea of holding dissent as holy is so crucial, so we make sure to lift up everyone as seen in the image of God. I want to conclude with a beautiful teaching about the word machloket that I've used quite a bit today. It comes from the Hebrew word chet lamed kuf, or chelek, a word to part or divide. And Hirschfeld and Foyer taught that this word, machloket l'shem shamayim, to have a machloket, a debate for the sake of heaven, part has to come from me and part has to come from the other person. And only when both parts are there can a machloket actually be for the sake of heaven and help us approach closer to the Holy One. Shabbat Shalom.